What's the worst or best thing you've ever seen happen at a wedding? Story 1. I attended a wedding where everything seemed perfect until the reception. The bride's father, a well-known business owner, was supposed to give a heartfelt speech. He had one, but what he said completely shocked everyone. Instead of the usual, "I'm proud of you" speech, he launched into a full-on rant about how his daughter had ruined his life by marrying someone he didn't approve of. He even went as far as to say that he didn't understand why she would lower herself by marrying a man who wasn't from their circle. The room went silent. The bride's face turned bright red, and her husband just stared at the floor. It felt like time stood still, and you could cut the tension with a knife. After an awkward silence, the bride stood up, calmly excused herself, and left the room. People just sat there, unsure whether they should continue eating or leave. It was honestly one of the most uncomfortable things I've ever seen at a wedding. The wedding continued after a while, but it was clear that everyone, including the couple, was rattled. Story 2. The best thing I've ever seen at a wedding wasn't something that was planned. It was a complete surprise. The groom had a beautiful surprise planned for the bride. During the reception, when the couple was just about to cut the cake, the groom stood up, clinked his glass to get everyone's attention, and said, "Before we go any further, I have something I want to show you." He turned to the DJ, and a video began to play. It was a montage of all the moments they had shared together, from their first date, their travels, their moments of laughter, and even the little everyday things that made their relationship special. But then the video took an unexpected turn. The groom had secretly filmed himself talking to all her closest friends and family members and asking them what they loved most about her. The video ended with everyone in the room holding up signs that said, "We love you." The bride started crying. Happy tears, of course, and everyone in the room was touched. The moment was beautiful and reminded us all that love is about the little things that make life so special. Story 3. I once went to a wedding where the bride was extremely adamant that everything be perfect. She had an insane list of rules for the guests, and let me tell you, I felt like I was walking on eggshells the entire day. She had these ridiculous, overly strict dress codes for each part of the day, from the ceremony to the reception. The ceremony was beautiful, but then came the reception, and that's when things took a weird turn. At the entrance, there were dress checkers who would give guests a thumbs up or down based on their outfits. I swear, I was judged by a 13-year-old flower girl who told me my shoes were the wrong color for the formal casual dress code. But the real kicker came when the bride, during the reception, made an announcement that anyone caught not adhering to her customized dress code would be kicked out. One of the bridesmaids, who had worn an absolutely stunning black dress, with permission, mind you, was asked to leave the reception because her dress was too fashion-forward. She had to stand outside until she changed into something else. Honestly, the whole thing was just so unnecessarily stressful. It really felt like a wedding turned into a fashion show. Story 4. I'll never forget the worst thing I've ever witnessed at a wedding. It was at a friend's wedding, and everything was going smoothly until it was time for the vows. The groom seemed nervous, but we all thought it was just the usual wedding jitters. But as soon as he started his vows, it became apparent that something was terribly off. Instead of speaking from the heart, he began reading a letter that sounded more like he was saying goodbye. It wasn't just an awkward speech, it was a full-on confession. He started talking about how he wasn't sure if he was ready for marriage, how he had been seeing someone else, and how, in truth, he didn't think he'd made the right choice in marrying her. The bride turned pale, then burst into tears. The guests were mortified, and the tension in the room was unbearable. He just stood there, watching her cry without moving an inch. Eventually, the bride ran out of the room and everyone just sat there in shock. The groom tried to apologize, but it was too late. It was the worst wedding disaster I've ever seen. Story 5. The most surreal thing I've ever seen at a wedding happened at my cousin's wedding a few years ago. It was a traditional church ceremony, and everything was going perfectly until the groom's ex-wife showed up. No one knew she was even invited, and I don't think the groom knew either. She showed up with her son, the groom's stepson, and made a scene in the middle of the ceremony. She walked right up to the altar, interrupting the priest, and said, "I'm sorry, but I just need to say something before this gets out of hand." Then she started ranting about how the groom was a liar, how he promised they would always be together, and how he was ruining the best thing that ever happened to him by marrying someone else. The bride's face was a mix of disbelief and anger. The groom was visibly uncomfortable but didn't know how to handle the situation. The ex-wife finally turned to the audience, pointed to her son, and said, "You can't just throw away family like this." The whole church was in chaos, and the wedding was basically put on hold for about 30 minutes as everyone tried to calm her down. Eventually, the groom had to ask her to leave, and they resumed the ceremony. It was beyond awkward, but somehow, they managed to finish the day. Needless to say, it's a wedding no one will ever forget. Story 6. I once attended a wedding where everything seemed to be going perfectly, until the maid of honor gave her speech. She had spent weeks practicing, so we were all expecting a sweet and emotional moment. She started off well enough, talking about how close she and the bride were, and how she had seen their relationship grow from the very beginning. But then, things took a turn. As she got more into the speech, she started to mention personal details of the bride's life, details that were meant to be kept private. She talked about the bride's past relationships, some embarrassing moments, and even cracked a joke about one of the bride's exes that no one saw coming. The worst part? The bride was sitting right there, clearly uncomfortable, with a bright red face. The rest of the guests were in stunned silence, unsure if we should laugh or just sit there awkwardly. The groom looked like he was about to explode with anger. The maid of honor, oblivious to the tension, continued on, even throwing in a few more funny anecdotes that made everyone cringe. The bride ended up getting up and walking out of the reception shortly after, leaving the rest of us to awkwardly carry on. It wasn't until later, when the maid of honor realized what she'd done, that we learned the bride didn't speak to her for weeks after the wedding. It was definitely one of the most cringe-worthy speeches I've ever witnessed. Story 7. I've been to a lot of weddings, but the one that stands out the most happened at my best friend's wedding. It was supposed to be a beautiful day, a classic ceremony at a church, followed by a reception at a lovely hall with all the usual dancing, cake cutting, and laughter. However, the reception took an unexpected turn when the groom's brother, who was supposed to give a toast, got up to speak. He had been a bit too cheerful at the open bar earlier, and his speech reflected that. He started off well, saying a few nice things about the couple, but then he began to get more and more emotional. By the time he got to the part where he talked about how deeply in love the groom was with the bride, he started sobbing uncontrollably. Everyone waited in silence for him to compose himself, but it only got worse. He began to cry louder, claiming he would never find love like the groom had, and at one point, he even mentioned that he had a crush on the bride years ago. This was all happening in front of the entire wedding party, and at least 200 guests were there, watching in stunned silence. The groom, clearly embarrassed, tried to intervene, but the brother continued with his emotional outburst. Eventually, security had to step in to escort him out of the room. The mood of the wedding shifted from celebration to discomfort. It wasn't until later in the night that we found out the groom's brother had been dealing with a rough breakup and was clearly not in the best emotional state to give a speech. It was an uncomfortable moment, but after a few awkward hours, the wedding went on. Though, of course, the brother was nowhere to be seen for the rest of the night. Story 8. The worst wedding I've ever been to was the one where the bride decided to change the entire ceremony last minute. We had all been planning for weeks, talking about how perfect the wedding was going to be and how great everything was going to look. But when we arrived at the venue, things were off. The dress rehearsal had gone perfect, but when the day arrived, the bride decided to switch things up in the most dramatic way. First, she made a surprise announcement. She didn't want to get married in the traditional ceremony space. Instead, she insisted on having the ceremony outside in the middle of the garden, despite rain clouds gathering above us. We all tried to talk her out of it, but she wouldn't listen. We ended up moving everything, chairs, the altar, flowers, out into the garden, and just as we started the ceremony, the sky opened up. It was a full-on downpour, and everyone scrambled to get under cover, but it was too late. The bride was soaked, her makeup was running down her face, and the groom, standing next to her, was not happy. Guests were drenched, and the entire ceremony felt completely out of control. But the bride insisted they continue. She went ahead with the vows, water dripping off her hair, and everyone sat there, freezing, wondering if the whole thing would be called off. Eventually, the groom called for a pause, and the ceremony was moved inside, but not before the bride had an emotional meltdown about how nothing was going according to plan. By the time we moved everything indoors, no one was in the mood to celebrate. The reception went on, but the tension in the air was palpable, and the bride seemed completely distant and upset. It was a wedding that could have been amazing but turned into a chaotic disaster due to last-minute decisions and the refusal to adapt to the situation. Story 9. The best wedding moment I've ever witnessed happened at a close friend's wedding. The couple had been dating for nearly 10 years, and we all knew their love story was one for the books. They had an intimate ceremony at a beautiful old chapel, followed by a cozy reception at a nearby venue. It wasn't the extravagant wedding that some people dream of, but it was clear from the moment the ceremony started that it was going to be the most meaningful wedding I'd ever attended. The best part? When it was time for the vows, the groom surprised the bride with something completely unexpected. Instead of just reciting traditional vows, he pulled out a box from his jacket pocket, walked up to the bride, and opened it. Inside was a delicate bracelet engraved with a message that only she would understand. As he placed it around her wrist, he said, "This is a reminder that no matter what life throws at us, we will always be together, forever." The bride immediately started crying, and the whole room was moved. It was such a personal, intimate moment that felt so genuine. The rest of the evening continued with laughter, toasts, and dancing, but that moment was something I'll never forget. It was proof that a wedding doesn't need to be over the top to be perfect. The love between them was so real and palpable, and you could see it in every word, every gesture, and every glance they shared that day. Story 10. I was at a wedding a couple of years ago where everything went wrong from the start, mainly because of one very difficult guest. The groom's mother, let's just say, wasn't a fan of the bride. She had openly criticized the wedding plans and even tried to change things behind the couple's back. The ceremony was already awkward because of the tension between the families, but things got even worse when the reception started. The bride and groom had carefully chosen a playlist for the evening, one that was meant to reflect their relationship. But as soon as the music started, the groom's mother marched up to the DJ and demanded that he play her favorite songs instead. When he refused, she started causing a scene in front of everyone. She started shouting that this wasn't her son's wedding, and how dare they not play the music she likes. At one point, she even grabbed the microphone and began singing over the music, loudly and off-key. The bride, visibly upset, tried to keep it together, but her mother-in-law wouldn't stop. The groom finally had to step in and ask his mother to leave, causing a massive family argument right there at the reception. It was one of the most uncomfortable and awkward things I've ever seen. The wedding ended up being more about dealing with family drama than actually celebrating the couple. Afterward, the bride and groom took some time to heal from the stress, and their marriage turned out to be strong despite the rocky start. But that wedding will always stand out as the most chaotic one I've ever been to. Story 11. I once attended a wedding where the couple had spent a lot of time planning every detail. They had an intimate outdoor ceremony with beautiful decorations, and the venue was perfect. However, things started to get awkward during the reception. The bride had a rather close-knit family, and her aunt, who was notoriously blunt, gave a speech. It was supposed to be lighthearted and funny, but instead, she began recounting stories from the bride's childhood in a way that made everyone uncomfortable. At one point, she told the entire room about the time the bride had gotten into trouble for sneaking out with a boy in high school, and she added some embarrassing details that the bride had clearly not wanted shared. The bride's face turned bright red, and you could feel the tension in the room. But the aunt wasn't done. She went on to talk about the bride's ex-boyfriends and even threw in some sarcastic comments about how the groom was finally the right one. By this point, the atmosphere had shifted from joyful to awkward. The groom stood there, unsure of what to say or do. The bride, clearly flustered, excused herself from the room. The awkwardness lingered for the rest of the night. And although things eventually went back to normal, that speech remained the biggest talking point among the guests. Story 12. The most entertaining wedding I've ever attended was one where the groom had an unusual surprise planned for the bride. They were both huge movie buffs, and during their reception, the groom asked the DJ to play a certain song. At first, it seemed like any other love song, but then the groom began singing. And when I say singing, I mean full-on, over-the-top performance, complete with dramatic hand gestures and belting out every note. But it wasn't just any love song. He had chosen the theme song from Titanic. Everyone in the room couldn't help but laugh, but the bride was grinning from ear to ear. She had no idea it was coming, and she was completely caught off guard. The groom wasn't known for his singing abilities, but he gave it his all, and the whole room joined in to support him. People started standing up and dancing, and by the end of the song, the entire reception was in full swing. It wasn't the smoothest performance, but it was one of the most fun and memorable wedding moments I've ever witnessed. The couple's joy was infectious, and that lighthearted moment set the tone for the rest of the night. Story 13. The worst wedding disaster I ever witnessed happened at a friend's wedding. Everything had been meticulously planned, and the ceremony was beautiful. However, the reception took a turn for the worse when the groom's cousin, who was supposed to be the designated wedding photographer, had a complete meltdown. Apparently, the cousin had been drinking heavily at the reception, and when it was time for the couple to take some family photos, he started snapping pictures with his phone instead of using the professional camera equipment he had brought. When the bride asked him to take a step back and let the professional handle it, he became defensive and started arguing with her. The situation escalated quickly, and before anyone could intervene, the cousin shouted at the bride in front of the entire guest list. The bride, visibly upset, asked him to leave, and after a heated exchange, he stormed off, leaving the wedding in chaos. The photographer had to step in to calm things down, and while the rest of the evening went on without further incident, it was clear that the tension lingered. The bride was upset about the scene, and the groom's family was embarrassed. It was an unfortunate incident, and it was talked about for months after the wedding. Although the wedding eventually continued, it was a reminder that even the best-laid plans can be derailed by an unexpected outburst. Story 14. One of the most beautiful weddings I've attended was a traditional ceremony in a cozy church with a stunning reception at a nearby hotel. The couple had been together for years and their love story was well known. However, there was one moment during the wedding that caught everyone off guard. It was during the vows, when the groom turned to the bride and began reciting his vows. At first, everything seemed normal, but then he stopped mid-sentence, looked the bride in the eye and said, "There's something I need to tell you. I know we've been through a lot together, but I've been keeping something from you." The room fell silent as the bride looked at him, unsure of what was happening. The groom then took a deep breath and continued, "I wanted to be completely honest with you. I've been planning a surprise honeymoon, but it's not just for the two of us. It's for all of us because we're going to Paris with both of our families." The entire congregation let out a collective gasp of surprise, and the bride's face lit up with joy. The groom had secretly organized the honeymoon of their dreams, and no one, not even the bride, had known. It was a moment of pure love and excitement, and it completely took everyone by surprise. The couple finished their vows with smiles on their faces, and the rest of the ceremony was filled with excitement as the bride and groom walked back down the aisle. It was a perfect moment in an already beautiful wedding. Story 15. A wedding I attended once took an unexpected turn when the bride and groom had to leave early due to an emergency. It all started when the groom's mother, who had a reputation for being a bit controlling, decided to give a toast during the reception. Everyone was expecting the usual heartfelt speech, but instead, the groom's mother launched into a lengthy tirade about how she wasn't entirely thrilled with the bride, and how she still didn't quite understand why her son had chosen her. She spent several minutes airing grievances about the bride's family and making snide comments about the couple's relationship. The bride sat there trying to remain composed, but it was clear that the tension was rising. The groom, visibly upset, stood up to stop his mother, but she refused to stop talking. At that moment, the bride stood up, excused herself, and walked out of the room. The groom followed, and the two of them were gone for a while. Guests were left in confusion, not knowing what was happening. Eventually, the couple returned, but they both seemed visibly shaken. The groom's mother was asked to leave shortly after, and the rest of the reception continued, though the mood had definitely shifted. Despite the drama, the couple stayed together, and they ended up having a happy marriage. However, the memory of that night, especially the tension caused by the groom's mother, remains a story we all talk about whenever weddings come up in conversation. Story 16. I was at a wedding a few years ago that had one of the most awkward situations I've ever witnessed. The ceremony was beautiful, but things took a strange turn when it was time for the cake cutting. The couple had chosen an intricate, multi-tiered cake that was both a work of art and a crowd favorite. As they were about to cut it, the groom seemed a bit distracted, and the bride asked if everything was okay. He hesitated, then said, "I think there's something I need to tell you." At first, everyone thought he was joking, but the moment turned serious quickly. He revealed, in front of all their guests, that he had been in a car accident earlier that day. His car was totaled, but he didn't want to ruin the wedding, so he kept it from the bride until this moment. She was completely stunned, and the groom immediately began to apologize for not telling her sooner. The room went quiet, and all the guests stood frozen, unsure how to react. The bride burst into tears, not because of the accident itself, but because she was hurt that he hadn't told her about it earlier. The groom, looking guilty, quickly assured her that he was fine, but she was still upset. The wedding took a somber tone for the next hour, and it wasn't until after they had a quiet conversation in private that they managed to salvage the day. Though the incident wasn't catastrophic, the sudden emotional weight of it cast a shadow over the entire reception. Story 17. One of the funniest wedding moments I've ever witnessed occurred at a close friend's ceremony. They had opted for a non-traditional wedding with a more casual, relaxed vibe. The bride was a huge fan of quirky surprises, so when it was time for the first dance, she told everyone that she and the groom had something special prepared. The music started, and instead of the slow, romantic ballad everyone was expecting, the couple busted into a full-on dance routine to Uptown Funk. The whole crowd was stunned at first, unsure of what was happening. But as they kept going, the crowd erupted into cheers and laughter. The couple had clearly spent hours learning the routine, and they were incredibly coordinated, hitting every move perfect. The guests couldn't stop laughing and clapping, and the energy in the room completely changed. It was a fantastic moment that brought everyone together and lightened the mood. It was a reminder that weddings don't always have to follow the usual script, and sometimes the most unexpected moments are the ones that make the event unforgettable. Story 18. I attended a wedding that had a serious mishap during the vows that still stands out in my memory. The couple had been together for several years, and their ceremony was expected to be beautiful and heartfelt. However, when it was time for the groom to speak his vows, he seemed strangely nervous. As he began to speak, he kept pausing, fumbling over words, and seemed completely out of sync. It wasn't until the bride, visibly concerned, whispered something to him that we all realized what was happening. He had forgotten his vows. His mind had gone completely blank, and he started stammering through generic promises like, "I promise to love you, I will stand by you," but it didn't seem personal at all. The audience was incredibly supportive, and some even tried to help by giving him subtle cues, but it was clear that he was flustered. The bride, being an absolute trooper, smiled and gently whispered, "Don't worry, just speak from your heart." The groom, now somewhat composed, began to speak more genuinely, though he was still embarrassed. The whole thing turned into an emotional moment that was less about the rehearsed vows and more about the real, honest feelings the groom had for his bride. Everyone in the room was incredibly moved by the rawness of it. In the end, it turned out to be a perfect moment, reminding everyone that love doesn't always follow a script. Story 19. A wedding I attended took a surprising and dramatic turn during the reception, and it all started with the best man's toast. Everyone knew the best man and the groom had been friends since childhood, so we expected a lighthearted, funny speech filled with inside jokes. But instead, the best man began to get choked up, which, given their friendship, was understandable. He started by reminiscing about how he had watched the groom grow up and how proud he was of him. But then he veered into uncharted territory. The best man started telling everyone that he had been in love with the bride for years. He went on to describe his feelings for her, how he had harbored a secret crush on her even before the groom and she had met, and how he'd always felt jealous of their relationship. The bride sat there, stunned and speechless. The groom, completely blindsided, looked at his friend with disbelief. He even said, "Are you serious right now?" The room was dead silent, and it felt like time stood still. The best man, realizing what he had done, quickly apologized, saying it wasn't meant to ruin the wedding, but that he had been holding these feelings in for too long. He quickly tried to save face by making a joke and finishing the speech. But the mood had completely changed. The groom had a quiet conversation with his best man afterward, and the bride excused herself for a while to collect her thoughts. It was an incredibly awkward situation that definitely put a damper on the rest of the night, but the couple eventually moved past it. However, I'm sure that the best man's words will never be forgotten. Story 20. I attended a wedding where everything went wonderfully until the moment when the bride's father, who had been very vocal throughout the planning process, made an unexpected announcement during the father-daughter dance. This man was very opinionated, and the couple had often clashed with him over details like the wedding venue and the guest list. Despite these issues, the bride had tried to keep the peace with her father. However, during the dance, he took the microphone and began speaking to the crowd. At first, it seemed like just a normal fatherly speech, but then it took an unexpected turn. He started talking about how he wasn't sure if he truly approved of the wedding, and how he still had some reservations about the groom. He stated that he didn't think the groom was good enough for his daughter, and that he felt the marriage was happening too quickly. The bride's face turned white, and you could feel the entire room tense up. People started exchanging uncomfortable glances, unsure of how to react. The groom, standing nearby, looked as though he was about to speak up, but before he could, the bride stepped in. With incredible composure, she asked her father to sit down and take a moment. She told him she loved him, but this was her decision, and she wasn't going to let him ruin her day. After an awkward silence, the father did sit down, and the dance continued, though no one really felt like celebrating after that. It was a heartbreaking moment for the bride, but she handled it with grace. Even though the wedding was beautiful, that speech remained the most unforgettable part of the day. Story 21. I was at a wedding a few years ago where the bride's ex-boyfriend was unexpectedly invited to the reception. No one knew why he was there except for the bride's best friend, who swore the ex and the bride were totally over. The groom was aware, but his family wasn't, and honestly, neither was I. As the evening wore on, the ex-boyfriend, who was already a bit tipsy, began to get more and more loud and obnoxious. He started making awkward comments about how he'd always loved her, and how the bride was making a huge mistake by marrying the groom. Everyone tried to ignore him, but the tension was undeniable. It was during the first dance when things really escalated. The ex got up and tried to interrupt the dance, walking straight into the couple's circle and demanding to have one last dance with the bride. He was quickly escorted out, but the drama didn't stop there. Later in the evening, the bride and groom had to step aside for a private conversation to hash things out. The ex had sent a string of passive-aggressive messages to the bride that night, continuing his manipulation. The whole thing cast a huge cloud over the reception, and the bride seemed distracted for the rest of the night. Eventually, everything calmed down, but I couldn't help but think how weird it was for a wedding to be overshadowed by someone from the past, and how complicated love can sometimes get. Story 22. One wedding I attended was filled with beautiful moments, But there was one part that took everyone by surprise. The ceremony was held in a stunning garden with flowers everywhere, and the couple had been together for over 12 years. But when it was time for the vows, things took a wild turn. The groom was absolutely perfect in his speech, pouring his heart out and promising to love and care for the bride forever. The bride, however, was a little different. She began to speak, but her words weren't what anyone expected. She started her vows with, "I need to admit something to you and everyone," and at that moment, the entire room went silent. She told the groom that she loved him but wasn't in love with him anymore. The entire crowd was shocked, and the groom stood there, frozen. She continued to say that their relationship had evolved into something more comfortable than passionate, and that she wasn't sure if they should go through with the wedding. There was a tense silence, and then she paused, looked at the groom and said, "But I will marry you today, because I respect you and I want to see where our relationship can go. I'll give it a try, because we've been through too much to walk away now." After what felt like an eternity of awkwardness, the groom nodded, and they exchanged vows. Although the wedding continued, the moment lingered. The guests were left questioning whether or not they were doing the right thing, and you could see that the couple's connection had shifted in a major way. It was one of the most emotionally complex weddings I've ever witnessed. Story 23. I attended a wedding where the bride's mother, who was known to be very controlling, tried to take over the entire event. At first, it wasn't noticeable. The ceremony was beautiful, the couple seemed happy, and everything was going according to plan. But then, during the reception, the bride's mother decided to step in and help with the speeches. She took the microphone from the best man before he could even start, and instead of the usual speech praising the couple and wishing them well, she began telling stories about her daughter's childhood. These weren't cute or funny stories. They were deeply personal, some embarrassing, and borderline inappropriate. She recounted details about her daughter's past relationships, including one she had when she was a teenager, and went into depth about how the bride was always too picky about men. The groom's face slowly turned from confusion to discomfort, and you could feel the tension in the air. The bride, who had been enjoying the reception until that point, suddenly looked mortified. After a particularly awkward story about the bride's first boyfriend, the bride's father had enough. He stood up, took the microphone from his wife, and made a toast about how proud he was of his daughter, without going into any detail about her teenage crushes. He subtly told the crowd that the speech wasn't representative of the kind of celebration they were aiming. The bride's mother, furious, stormed off to the bathroom. The rest of the evening continued, but the entire atmosphere had been shaken by her unnecessary interference. It was the first time I had seen a wedding where the bride's mother's drama overshadowed the actual celebration. Story 24. The most magical wedding I've ever seen was an outdoor ceremony in a lush vineyard. The couple was incredibly in love, and everything from the venue to the weather was absolutely perfect. However, what really made the day unforgettable was the bride's father. The father-daughter dance was always going to be a sweet moment, but the bride's father took it to a whole new level. As they began dancing to a slow, romantic song, the father suddenly whispered something to the DJ, and the music changed. It went from the traditional slow dance song to a much more upbeat track. At first, the bride looked confused, but then she realized what was happening. The song was Let's Dance by David Bowie. Her father had secretly rehearsed a dance routine with her, and when the song hit, they began performing an energetic, choreographed dance routine that had the entire wedding party cheering. They spun, twirled, and jumped through some pretty impressive moves for a father-daughter duo. The guests were in absolute shock, and everyone crowded the dance floor to join in. It wasn't just a dance. It was a celebration of their unique bond and the fun energy they brought to the wedding. The bride, in the middle of the routine, was beaming with joy, and the groom looked on in awe. It was a surprising, delightful twist to a traditional moment that no one will ever forget. Story 25. I attended a wedding where the groom, while giving his speech, revealed a shocking and deeply emotional story. The ceremony had been stunning, with all of the guests enjoying the beautiful setting and heartfelt vows. But it was during the reception, when the groom took the microphone to thank everyone for attending, that things took a strange turn. He began to talk about the bride's late mother and how much he regretted not meeting her before she passed away. He mentioned how he had always dreamed of asking for her blessing to marry her daughter, and that, had she been alive, she would have been so proud of her. The groom then revealed that he had actually spent months secretly planning a way to have a private conversation with. He had contacted a medium. Yes, a psychic medium. He went on to describe the experience of connecting with the bride's mother through the medium, and how he felt as if her spirit had blessed their marriage. The guests were floored, unsure how to react. Some looked uncomfortable, others were moved by the sincerity of his words, and a few just didn't know how to process it. The bride, upon hearing this, burst into tears, not out of sadness but because she felt touched by how much the groom wanted her mother to be a part of their union. The rest of the reception had an air of reverence to it, and everyone seemed to appreciate the groom's willingness to be so open about his emotional connection to the bride's family. It was an unforgettable moment of love and loss woven together, but it left everyone talking for days afterward. Story 26. One wedding I attended had what seemed like the perfect start. Everything from the ceremony to the venue was beautiful. However, the reception took a dramatic turn when the groom's ex-girlfriend showed up uninvited. No one knew she was coming, and as soon as she walked in, she went straight to the bar and started making herself comfortable. She wasn't quiet about her arrival either. She loudly greeted some of the groom's friends and made small talk with everyone around her. It was clear from the way she was acting that she wasn't there as a simple guest. She seemed determined to be the center of attention. As the night went on, she kept trying to insert herself into the conversation with the bride and groom. She'd stand close to the couple, leaning in and making remarks like, "Remember when we used to come here together?" Or, "I used to love this song." At first, the bride tried to be polite, but it became obvious that the groom's ex was intentionally trying to remind everyone of their past relationship. The tension in the room grew thicker, and by the time the father-daughter dance began, the bride had had enough. She calmly walked over to the ex and said, "I think it's time for you to go." Surprisingly, the ex was understanding, but as she was escorted out, she made a final jab at the groom by saying, "You'll always be my first love, I guess." The bride, visibly upset, went on to enjoy the rest of the evening with her family and friends. But the awkwardness of the moment lingered for the rest of the night. It was the strangest wedding situation I've ever witnessed. Story 27. A wedding I attended a few years ago had one of the most chaotic yet hilarious moments I've ever witnessed. The ceremony was held at a lovely outdoor venue, and everything seemed perfect until the reception began. The bride had hired a band to provide entertainment, and everything was going smoothly until they started playing a song that was clearly a fan favorite. The bride, who was known for her quirky sense of humor, jumped up and grabbed the microphone. She excitedly told the guests, "Okay, everyone, let's turn this wedding into a dance party." Without skipping a beat, she launched into a full-on performance of Single Ladies by Beyoncé. The groom was completely caught off guard, but he didn't hesitate for long before jumping in. Soon, they were both dancing and the entire wedding party joined in. It wasn't a simple, "let's just dance" moment. Oh no. The bride and groom went all out with synchronized moves and even a little improvisation, with the whole dance floor cheering them on. By the time the song was over, the bride's dress was a bit rough, the groom had lost his jacket, and their energy had everyone in the room completely energized. It was one of those moments that seemed to lift everyone's spirits and break the formality of the event. The reception turned into a dance-off, with everyone showing off their best moves. The couple's energy was infectious, and no one wanted the party to stop. It was the most fun I've ever had at a wedding, and it was a true reflection of the couple's vibrant personalities. Story 28. I attended a wedding where the groom did something that left everyone absolutely speechless. The ceremony had been beautiful, traditional, heartfelt, and meaningful. But it was during the reception that things took a strange turn. The groom, known for his love of practical jokes, had planned a surprise for his bride. As the speeches began, he stood up and said, "Before we go any further, I need to do something special for my bride. This is my gift to you." With that, he reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. At first, the bride looked confused, but she smiled and took the envelope from him. As she opened it, she found what looked like a letter. The groom then began explaining that this letter was the truth, his truth. He started reading aloud a list of confessions about his past relationships. Some were humorous, some were embarrassing, but as he went on, it became clear that he was airing his past dirty laundry in front of all their guests. The bride looked stunned, and some of the guests were visibly uncomfortable. At one point, the groom revealed a few secrets about his exes, including a hilarious yet awkward moment when he accidentally texted his ex's mother instead of her, claiming he had moved on, but had never forgotten about it. The room was silent until the bride, finally realizing it was all a joke, burst into laughter. She turned to the groom and said, "You really had me going there for a minute." It was a mix of relief and awkwardness, but in the end, everyone was laughing. Despite the tension it caused at the time, it was a memorable and lighthearted moment that broke the ice during the reception. Story 29. I once attended a wedding where things seemed to go wrong from the moment the reception began. The bride and groom had clearly put a lot of effort into making sure everything went according to plan. But there was one detail no one had accounted for: an uninvited guest. The groom's uncle, a notorious prankster, showed up unexpectedly at the reception, not only uninvited, but also incredibly intoxicated. He was known for his antics, but no one expected him to cause any real trouble. However, during the dinner, The uncle began making loud comments about how the bride was too good for the groom and how he didn't approve of their union. No one could figure out what had set him off, but it quickly became clear that he was causing a scene. As the evening wore on, the uncle started disrupting speeches and even tried to grab the microphone during the best man's toast. It got so bad that the bride's father had to step in and ask him to leave. The uncle, however, wasn't having it. He shouted, "You can't kick me out, I'm family," and tried to make a joke out of the situation. But it was no longer funny. The mood had completely shifted. Security was called and the uncle was escorted out. But the damage had been done. The bride and groom were clearly shaken, and the reception continued in a much quieter, more subdued manner. Even though the night was still filled with love and support from friends and family, that moment of chaos remained in everyone's minds. It was a wedding where everything seemed perfect, except for that one person who just couldn't let it go. Story 30. I attended a wedding where the groom had something incredibly unexpected planned as a surprise for the bride. The couple had been together for over a decade, so when it was time for the vows, everyone thought they had heard it all. But the groom's vow left everyone in the room stunned. As he spoke, he said, "Before I say anything else, I have something I need to tell you, and it's important." The bride, confused but intrigued, nodded, as did everyone else. The groom then explained that he had made a vow years ago, long before they even considered marriage, to travel to 5 different countries in search of something special, a rare artifact. The groom pulled out a small box, opened it, and inside was a beautiful necklace. He then went on to explain how he had taken that artifact from every country he visited, promising himself that he would give it to the person he loved most when the time was right. The bride, emotional and in tears, realized that he had been planning this gift for years, even before they were together. The entire room gasped in awe as the groom placed the necklace around her neck. It wasn't just a beautiful gesture, it was a demonstration of his commitment and the thoughtfulness he had put into their relationship. The bride, overwhelmed with love, kissed him and whispered, "I don't know how I ever deserved this." It was one of the most romantic and touching moments I've ever witnessed at a wedding, and it set the tone for the rest of the celebration. It wasn't just a gift, it was a symbol of his dedication and the long journey they had both been on to get to this point. Story 31. I once attended a wedding where everything seemed to go smoothly, until the reception. The couple had planned a fun, casual evening with a lot of dancing and interactive games. But one part of the evening became so awkward that it still gets talked about to this day. The bride's cousin, who was one of the bridesmaids, was a little too excited about giving her speech. She started off with kind words about the couple, but then, in a sudden change of tone, she launched into a story about the bride's past that no one was expecting. It wasn't a funny or sweet memory, but a very personal and painful. The time when the bride had gone through a difficult breakup before meeting the groom. The cousin detailed how the bride had struggled, mentioning things that were clearly meant to be kept private, like how she'd cried for weeks after the breakup and how she was lost until she met the groom. The room fell silent, and you could see the bride's face turn bright red. Her mother was mortified and tried to stop her cousin, but it was too late. The bride was visibly uncomfortable and quickly excused herself to the restroom. The awkward silence lingered for what felt like an eternity, and the rest of the speeches were stilted and quiet. When the bride returned, she was a trooper, giving a polite but somewhat strained smile. The cousin apologized later, but the damage had been done. The bride never spoke to her cousin the same way again, and that speech became the wedding's most unforgettable and cringeworthy moment. Story 32. I attended a wedding once where the groom had the most incredible surprise planned for his bride. The couple had been together for a long time, and everyone expected a typical wedding: lovely vows, touching speeches, and a fun reception. But when the time came for the bride to make her entrance, the groom stood up and gestured to the DJ. The crowd expected the traditional bridal, but instead, the groom had arranged a surprise flash mob with the entire wedding party. The music started, and the groom began dancing to a beat no one expected, followed by the bride's closest friends and family members. The bride, who had no idea this was happening, gasped in shock when she walked into the room. Her face lit up with surprise as the group of dancers performed a choreographed routine to Happy by Pharrell Williams. It wasn't just a few people. The entire wedding party, from the flower girl to the best man, joined in. The bride laughed and even jumped in to dance herself. The guests erupted into cheers, clapping along to the rhythm, and the whole room was filled with energy and joy. It was such a fun, unexpected moment that completely changed the vibe of the evening. The couple's bond was evident in their playful energy, and the bride's happiness was contagious. The flash mob became the highlight of the wedding, and it's still talked about whenever anyone mentions that wedding. Story 33. The worst wedding I ever attended was one that looked perfect on the surface, but quickly fell apart due to one major detail: the groom's refusal to get rid of his ex-girlfriend. The bride and groom had been together for several years, and they had a beautiful ceremony at a charming venue. However, as the night wore on, it became apparent that something wasn't right. The groom's ex-girlfriend, who had been invited as a friend, started acting a little too familiar with the groom. She was all smiles, talking to him a little too closely, and even laughed off a few awkward moments where she touched his arm in a way that felt entirely inappropriate for a wedding. At first, everyone tried to ignore it, but as the evening went on, it was impossible not to notice. When it was time for the father-daughter dance, the groom's ex-girlfriend made a scene by trying to join the dance floor with the bride and her father. The bride, visibly upset, had to politely ask her to leave. It was clear that the groom wasn't thrilled about it but didn't step up to support his bride. Eventually, after some uncomfortable tension and a brief argument between the couple, the ex-girlfriend finally left. But the mood had already shifted. The bride spent the rest of the night in tears, and the groom seemed distant, clearly embarrassed by the whole ordeal. The wedding continued, but the entire evening felt strained. Later, we learned that the groom had invited his ex, despite the bride's objections, because he didn't want to make waves. It was a truly uncomfortable night, and the couple never seemed to recover from the incident. Story 34. One wedding I attended had a complete twist, and not in a good way. The couple had been together for several years, and their wedding day was meant to be a celebration of their love. The ceremony went off without a hitch, and everyone was in high spirits. However, things started to unravel during the reception, when the best man stood up to give his toast. Everyone was expecting the usual stories about how the groom and best man met, how they grew up together, and the usual humorous anecdotes. But what came next was not what anyone anticipated. The best man started talking about how great of a friend the groom was, but then he began recounting some seriously inappropriate stories from their past. At first, the stories were funny, but they quickly became uncomfortable. He started revealing secrets about the groom's past relationships, even bringing up personal details about the bride's family. The bride's father, who had been quiet throughout the evening, suddenly stood up and asked the best man to stop. But the best man, clearly tipsy, ignored him and continued telling embarrassing stories about the groom's wild days before he met the bride. The room grew tense, and some guests started to leave the reception early. The groom, clearly embarrassed, had to step in and stop the best man before things went any further. By that point, the damage had been done. The bride was visibly upset, and the couple spent the next hour trying to calm down her family. The wedding, which had started so beautifully, ended up with a feeling of discomfort that lingered long after the reception. It was a reminder that sometimes, even the closest of friends don't know when to stop.